Champagne glasses. A banner that read, "Congratulations, Captain Hale," in looping gold script. My sister's laugh cutting through the noise like she owned the air in the room. "Black Viper never scared me," Paige said, tossing her hair back the way she does when she wants an audience. "Please. Half those training legends are exaggerated for the recruits." Nobody at that party except one man near the drink table had any reason to know that Black Viper was standing 8 feet away, holding a glass of water, wearing a plain navy dress and no name tag at all. I didn't correct her. I'd stopped correcting Paige a long time ago, somewhere around the point I realized the correction never actually landed, it just gave her something new to laugh off in front of a crowd. A tall man in dress blues near the back of the hall had gone very still. I recognized him immediately, Colonel Renata Voss, a senior evaluator I'd trained under years earlier, during a cycle almost nobody in that room had clearance to know about. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her eyes had locked onto mine with the particular stillness of someone recalculating a fact they'd assumed was settled. "Captain," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to catch it. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Paige's smile faltered, the first crack in it all evening. Voss straightened her shoulders the way soldiers do out of instinct, not command, and said the sentence that would unravel 14 years of careful silence in under 5 seconds. "It's an honor to see you again, Viper." To understand why that single word landed the way it did, you have to understand what it was like growing up as Elena Hale in a house where love sometimes came with a scoreboard nobody admitted was running. I was born 6 years before Paige, which meant I spent most of my childhood as an only child before abruptly becoming the older sister of a baby who, from the moment she could talk, seemed determined to be seen. Paige wasn't cruel. I want to be honest about that from the start, because it would be easy to tell this story like she was a villain from page 1. She was a little girl who needed applause the way some people need air, and in a house with 2 exhausted parents stretched thin across work and bills, the loudest performance got the biggest reaction. I was the opposite, quiet, self-contained, the kind of kid who finished her homework without being asked and didn't mention a good grade unless someone specifically requested to see it. My mother used to call me low maintenance, which sounds like a compliment until you understand what it actually means inside a family. It means nobody has to spend energy noticing you. Our father, Walter Hale, had served briefly in the army in his 20s before a training injury cut things short. He rarely talked about it, but you could tell it had left something unfinished in him, a debt he seemed to be waiting for one of his daughters to settle. When I enlisted, he was proud. Genuinely, visibly proud. For a while I was the daughter finishing what he'd started. Then my work began to shift into territory I couldn't discuss at the dinner table, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because certain assignments simply function that way. You learn to speak in careful generalities and let people fill in the blanks however they like. Every time my father asked what I'd been doing, I'd offer something like training exercises, or an evaluation cycle, and I could watch disappointment settle into his face in real time, like he'd been hoping for a war story and gotten a shrug instead. Paige never had that problem. She told everyone everything. Every course, every score, every commendation, delivered with the kind of detail that makes people lean in at parties. Because I stayed quiet and she stayed loud, our family drew one simple conclusion over the years, a conclusion nobody stated out loud but everybody clearly believed: Paige was going somewhere. I was standing still. I didn't argue with that story. Partly out of pride. Partly because family dinners never felt like the right venue to unpack classified work. And partly, if I'm honest, because some tired quiet part of me had stopped believing correction would change anything even if I tried. So I let silence do what silence always does in families like mine, it filled in with someone else's version of events. Over time, Paige's version began casting me as a supporting character in her own success story. Small comments dropped so casually they barely registered as cruel. "Not everyone's built for the sharp end, Lena," she said once at a 4th of July barbecue, in front of half the block. "You were always more of a desk person, anyway," she offered at a dinner I'd driven 5 hours to attend. I let those roll off, or at least I told myself they did. What none of them knew, what I never told them, because by then I genuinely believed they wouldn't understand it even if I explained it in detail, was that I'd been selected years earlier for a specialized program built around reconnaissance, precision marksmanship, and later, instructor development. It wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine when they hear the word sniper. No cinematic music, no slow-motion trigger pulls. It was patience. Discipline. Hundreds of hours spent learning to wait, to observe, to never act until certainty arrived. That's where the call sign came from. Not from body counts or Hollywood theatrics, the truth was almost boring by comparison. It came from the way I worked, patient, nearly invisible, until the exact moment I needed to be seen. Instructors used to joke that you never knew Viper was in the room until it was too late for it to matter. The name outlived my active field role. Years later, evaluation frameworks I'd helped build were still being used to test new officers, long after I'd transitioned into command and instruction myself. In certain circles, Viper had become something like a benchmark, a standard people measured themselves against without ever knowing whose standard it actually was. At home, though, none of that existed. At home I was still just Elena, who's also in the army. Which brings us back to that ballroom, to Paige's champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips, to Colonel Voss stepping forward into a silence the whole room could suddenly feel. "What did she just call you?" Paige asked, turning to face me. I met her eyes and didn't flinch. "You heard her." For a long moment, nobody in that ballroom moved. Then Paige did what Paige always does when the ground shifts beneath her, she reached for a joke to steady herself. "Colonel, you mean her?" She laughed, gesturing at me like I was a punchline that hadn't landed yet. "This is my sister. Elena." Voss's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened slightly, the way a person's face does when they realize a joke isn't a joke at all. "I know exactly who I mean, Lieutenant." I watched something ripple through the officers clustered around Paige. A few of the younger ones exchanged glances, the look of people who'd heard the name Black Viper spoken with reverence in classrooms and briefing rooms, now trying to reconcile that mythology with the quiet woman by the drink table holding a glass of water. Voss didn't launch into a speech. That's not how these moments work in real life, no matter what television suggests. She simply stated, evenly, that I'd been part of the team that developed and evaluated several of the standards used in the course Paige had just completed. Then she added the detail that actually did the damage. "One of the evaluations that gave you the most trouble, Lieutenant, was built off a methodology she developed." I watched the color drain slightly from my sister's face, not because the words were an insult, but because they were true, and true things land harder than anything meant to wound on purpose. My father was the first to break the silence. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" His voice carried something I hadn't heard directed at me in years, genuine bewilderment, maybe the beginning of hurt. "I didn't raise my voice. I never have." "When exactly would you have listened?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could see him running back through years of dinners and holidays, searching for a moment he'd apparently decided in advance he didn't need to make space for. I didn't wait for him to find one. I reminded him, calmly, of the Thanksgiving I'd tried to explain a new assignment and my mother had gently redirected the table back to Paige's upcoming fitness test, the way conversation in our house always had a gravitational pull toward whatever Paige was doing next. "Let Paige have this," my mother had told me once, years earlier, when I'd merely mentioned, not even asked for anything, that I had news of my own. "She's finally doing something exceptional." I hadn't argued then. I didn't argue now. I just let the memory sit in the room between us like something finally allowed to breathe. To her credit, Paige didn't stay quiet for long. "So I have a call sign I didn't know about," she said, arms crossing. "That doesn't erase what I did. I still finished first in my class." "You did," I said, and meant it. This wasn't a moment where I needed to take her achievement away to feel like mine mattered. "And you should be proud of that." That answer seemed to catch her more off guard than anything else that night. She'd braced for a fight, some kind of victory lap on my part, and instead got something disorientingly close to grace. That's when Voss spoke again, quieter but somehow carrying more weight. "Lieutenant, being good was never the problem. Thinking you had nothing left to learn, that's the problem." Paige's jaw tightened. I watched her search for a comeback and come up empty, which for a woman who always had one loaded, was its own kind of tell. Voss turned toward her with an expression that had shifted from formal to something closer to concern. "Did you tell everyone here what actually happened during your final evaluation?" I watched my sister's face change into something I'd never seen on her before. Not embarrassment. Something closer to fear. During a simulated compromised approach scenario, Paige's spotter had flagged a discrepancy, a signal she should have paused to reassess. She hadn't. She'd trusted her own read over the correction, and in a live situation, that call would have carried real consequences. In training, it simply meant a failed objective and an uncomfortable debrief that went into her file for good. She passed, Voss clarified. "I want to be clear about that." But the board attached a mentorship requirement to her file. Someone senior, with a comparable background, to work with her before her next assignment. I felt what was coming before she said it. The name attached to that recommendation, Voss said, looking at me now, was Elena Hale. Paige's head snapped toward me so fast her earring caught the light. She hadn't known. I could see it plainly, not performance, not damage control. Genuine shock. 3 days later, Paige showed up at my office. No dress uniform, no champagne, no audience. Just her, a manila folder tucked under one arm, looking like someone who hadn't slept and had decided sleep wasn't the priority. "I want to know what I did wrong," she said. No preamble, no apology yet either, but something in her voice had shifted since the party. A directness that wasn't performing for anyone. We went through her file line by line. I asked her to walk me through her thinking during the compromised approach scenario, not the version she'd told our parents, but what had actually gone through her mind when her spotter flagged the discrepancy. "I thought I was right," she admitted. "I was so sure I didn't think his correction was worth the time it would cost to double-check it." "And were you right?" "No," she said. "I wasn't." "That's not actually the problem, Paige," I told her. "Being wrong happens to everyone, especially people who are exceptionally good at what they do, because they've had less practice recognizing it in the moment. The problem is you didn't leave room for the possibility that you might be." I told her something I'd never said out loud to anyone outside my professional circle. The moment you start believing your reputation will save you is the moment your reputation becomes dangerous. Over the following months, our sessions became a fixture, twice a week, always in that office, always without an audience. I didn't make it easy, and I don't think she wanted me to. Slowly, my sister began to change in ways that had nothing to do with technical skill, because technical skill had never been the actual issue. She started listening to her spotters. Actually listening, not waiting for her turn to be right. She admitted mistakes out loud instead of reframing them as someone else's failure to understand her. Most importantly, and this took the longest, she stopped needing me to be smaller so she could feel larger. A year passed the way years do when you're not paying close attention to them. Another promotion, another ballroom, though the room felt different this time. Plainly in front of the people who'd spent years failing to notice what that relationship actually meant. It landed somewhere deeper in me than the reveal at that first party ever had. Because that night a year earlier, I'd been seen for what I'd done. This time, I was being seen for who I was. Afterward, my father found me near the drink table, the same spot I always gravitate toward at these events, close enough to belong, far enough to breathe. "I should have asked more about your life," he said, instead of assuming I already understood it. I accepted that. Accepting it didn't mean pretending the missed ceremonies and quiet years of being introduced as also in the army hadn't happened. Healing, I've learned, isn't about deleting the record. It's about deciding what kind of relationship you're willing to build going forward, with your eyes open. Later, after most of the guests had filtered out, Paige found me by the door. That night, at my first party, she said, "What were you going to say before Voss showed up?" I thought about it honestly. Nothing. She laughed, surprised. Seriously? Seriously. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, the woman she'd become, someone who'd finally learned to sit with being wrong instead of performing being right, and gave her the truest answer I had. Because if you have to tell people who you are, I said, eventually you're going to meet someone who already knows. If this story found you somewhere true, I'd love to hear where. Drop a comment and let me know which part stayed with you longest, and if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe. There's always more where this came from.